There is a reason synchronicities feel different lately. Not louder, not more dramatic, but sharper, more precise, almost uncomfortable in how accurately they land. And if you've noticed that subtle shift, the sense that these moments are no longer charming coincidences but something heavier, something exact, then you're already inside the threshold this video is pointing toward. Because the truth is, synchronicity does not appear the way most people think it does. It does not arrive to guide you forward or to reassure you that you're on the right path or to give you permission to move. That belief is comforting, but it's incomplete, and you can feel that it's incomplete. You felt it in the moments where a coincidence didn't inspire excitement, but stillness, where something aligned so cleanly that it didn't feel magical. It felt final. You didn't celebrate it. You absorbed it. And something in you quietly adjusted. You didn't arrive at this video looking for signs. You arrived because something has already settled. That's important to notice. There's a difference between searching for meaning and recognizing it after the fact. Most people never learn the difference, but you have. Or at least you're beginning to. And that's why synchronicity no longer feels like a message coming toward you. It feels like something confirming a movement that has already happened inside you. Think about the last time a synchronicity stopped you in your tracks. Not because it was impressive, but because it was too accurate to ignore. It didn't feel like the universe saying, "Go this way." It felt like the world briefly reflecting something you had already accepted, even if you hadn't said it out loud yet. That quiet internal click. That moment where you realized you were already past the point of debating. You didn't decide because of the sign appeared because the decision was already complete. This is where the way you've been taught to see synchronicity begins to fall apart, and you can feel that collapse starting now. Because if synchronicities were truly guidance, they would appear before commitment. They would help you choose, but that's not how the most meaningful ones show up, is it? The ones that stay with you don't arrive when you're undecided. They arrive when something has already been crossed, when a line has already been stepped over internally, whether you acknowledged it or not. You've felt this before, that sense that life had already shifted before the evidence caught up, before the conversation happened, before the opportunity appeared, before the confirmation arrived. There was a subtle moment, often quiet, often overlooked, where something in you stopped negotiating. And only after that did the world seem to respond, not to persuade you, but to mirror you. And this is where most people misunderstand what they're experiencing. They think synchronicity is the cause, but it's the echo. It's the surface ripple that appears after something deeper has already reorganized. When you start seeing it this way, something changes in how you relate to these moments. They stop feeling exciting and start feeling sobering. They stop feeling like invitations and start feeling like markers, not of where you're going, but of where you can no longer return from. If this feels unsettling, that's because it's meant to be. This isn't a comforting perspective. It doesn't place you in a passive relationship with reality. It doesn't position you as someone waiting for approval. It quietly hands responsibility back to you, not as a burden, but as a recognition. You've already been moving, you've already been choosing. Synchronicity is simply the moment you notice the movement has become irreversible. And here's the part most people never talk about. Synchronicities tend to intensify precisely when identity begins to loosen, when the version of you that used to deliberate, delay, or doubt can no longer hold its shape. That's when meaning floods in, not because you're awakening, not because you're aligned, but because the old structure is destabilizing and reality reflects that instability with an unusual clarity. Patterns become visible, connections surface. The world starts to feel oddly coordinated, not to guide you, but to reveal what's already collapsing. You can feel whether this is true for you right now. There's a specific sensation that comes with it, a mix of clarity and grief, relief and seriousness. The sense that something is being confirmed, not offered. And once you recognize this pattern, you can't unsee it. Synchronicity stops being something you look for and starts being something you recognize in hindsight, as evidence that a threshold has already been crossed. This is why this video isn't about teaching you how to notice more signs. It's about changing how you interpret the ones that are already appearing, because the most important synchronicities don't ask for your attention. They assume it. They arrive when something in you has already said yes or no in a way that cannot be undone. And if you're still listening, it's because part of you already knows this. You're not here to learn what synchronicity is. You're here because you felt the moment where it stopped feeling optional, where it stopped feeling mystical, where it started feeling like a quiet confirmation that something in your life has already shifted, whether you've named it yet or not. But this is only the beginning, because once you understand when synchronicity appears, the rest of the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Once you begin to sense that synchronicity is not a signal arriving before movement, but a reflection appearing after something has already shifted, an entirely different pattern starts to reveal itself. At first, it's subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but the more honestly you look at your own life, the harder it becomes to ignore. The moments that mattered most were never preceded by signs, they were followed by them, and that reversal changes everything. Think back carefully, not to the dramatic stories people like to tell about synchronicity, but to the quieter ones you rarely hear spoken aloud, the ones where a door opened effortlessly, but only after you had already let go of needing it to. The conversation that appeared only after you stopped rehearsing what you would say. The opportunity that emerged once you had accepted, internally, that it might never arrive. You weren't guided into those moments. You had already crossed something internally, and reality responded in kind. This is where most people misread their own experience. They remember the coincidence and forget the internal commitment that preceded it. They tell the story starting from the external event because the internal shift was silent. But silence does not mean insignificance. In fact, the most consequential decisions you've ever made were likely never announced. They didn't arrive as dramatic declarations. They arrived as a quiet cessation, a stopping, a subtle withdrawal of resistance. And that is the moment synchronicity begins to gather. You can feel the truth of this if you allow yourself to slow down and notice the internal timeline rather than the external one. There is often a precise moment where you stop arguing with yourself, where the internal back and forth dissolves, where something resolves, not emotionally, but structurally. You may still feel fear, you may still feel uncertainty, but the negotiation has ended, and it's after this moment, not before, that the world begins to mirror coherence. This is why synchronicities often seem to arrive out of nowhere. Not because they are random, but because the causal moment happened somewhere you weren't taught to look. Inside the space where identity reorganizes, inside the moment where a version of you quietly steps aside. Reality doesn't respond to words or affirmations, it responds to structure. And structure shifts long before behavior does. If you're honest, you've already noticed this pattern playing out. There are times when you desperately wanted a sign and nothing appeared, and other times when signs cascaded without effort, without intention, without asking. That contrast isn't a punishment or a reward, it's feedback. When you are undecided internally, the field remains diffuse. When something locks in, coherence appears. Synchronicity is not the cause of alignment, it is the visible byproduct of it. And here's where this becomes deeply personal, because recognizing this means you can no longer outsource responsibility to signs. You can no longer wait for confirmation before you move. You begin to realize that the absence of synchronicity is not a failure of faith, but an honest reflection of internal fragmentation. And the presence of synchronicity is not a green light, but a receipt, proof that something has already been purchased at a level deeper than conscious thought. This understanding changes how you relate to waiting. Waiting used to feel passive, like holding your breath for the universe to respond. But once you see the pattern clearly, waiting becomes diagnostic. You start asking different questions. Not, why hasn't the sign appeared, but what inside me is still unresolved? Not what am I supposed to do, but what decision am I still postponing? And those questions don't demand immediate answers, they demand honesty. You may notice a subtle discomfort arising as you listen. That's not resistance, it's recognition. Because this perspective removes the illusion that synchronicity exists to comfort you. It reveals that it exists to reflect you. And reflection is neutral. It doesn't persuade, it doesn't soothe, it simply shows you what has already solidified beneath the surface of your life. This is also why synchronicities tend to intensify during periods of inner contraction rather than expansion. When something is ending, when an identity is loosening, when an old self-concept is no longer sustainable, but the new one hasn't fully formed yet. During these in-between spaces, internal structure is unstable and instability reveals pattern. The world begins to feel strangely coordinated because your internal narrative has momentarily dropped out. You felt this, that period where life felt thin, where meaning leaked through cracks that weren't there before, where conversations, symbols, encounters, and timing felt unusually precise, not comforting, not exciting, just exact. Those moments weren't invitations to believe harder. They were markers that something inside you was reorganizing at a fundamental level. And this is where synchronicity stops being mystical and starts being sobering. Because if it appears after commitment, then it is indifferent to your preferences. It doesn't care whether you feel ready, it doesn't wait for your confidence, it shows up when the internal shift has already occurred, and once it does, you're no longer deciding whether to move forward, you're deciding whether to resist what has already begun. Most people sense this and retreat. They explain it away, they reduce it to coincidence, not because it isn't meaningful, but because meaning carries weight. Meaning implies responsibility, and responsibility implies that the story you've been telling yourself about being unsure, unready, or undecided may no longer be true. If this resonates, it's because you're already sensing that your relationship with synchronicity has changed. You're no longer asking for signs. You're noticing patterns after the fact. You're recognizing confirmations you didn't consciously request. And that recognition carries a quiet gravity, because it suggests that something in your life has already moved from possibility into inevitability. This is not about belief. It's about timing, about sequence, about understanding that the order you were taught, sign first, action second, is backwards. The actual sequence runs in reverse: internal resolution, structural commitment, then reflection, then confirmation. And once you see this clearly, you cannot return to the old interpretation without feeling its hollowness. You don't need to do anything with this yet. You don't need to act. You don't need to decide. Simply noticing the pattern is enough to begin shifting how reality responds to you, because attention itself reorganizes perception. And perception determines what becomes visible. But this is still only the outer layer, because once you understand when synchronicity appears, a deeper and more unsettling question begins to surface. Why does it intensify so dramatically when identity itself begins to dissolve? And what exactly is being marked when those coincidences start to feel less like guidance and more like a point of no return? There is a reason synchronicities do not merely continue once they begin. They intensify. They cluster, they stack. They start appearing so frequently that you almost hesitate to talk about them. Not because they feel unbelievable, but because they feel too precise to explain without sounding ungrounded. And yet, if you look closely, their intensity is not random. It follows a very specific internal condition. Synchronicities surge when identity begins to loosen. This is the part that is rarely named, even in spaces that talk openly about meaning and alignment. Synchronicity is not strongest when you are confident in who you are. It is strongest when who you are can no longer hold. When the internal structure that once organized your decisions, relationships, and sense of direction begins to destabilize, reality responds with pattern. Meaning rushes in to fill the space left behind by certainty. And this is why these moments often feel both illuminating and disorienting at the same time. You may recognize this period immediately. It is not dramatic in the way stories describe awakenings. It is quieter, more ambiguous. You may still be functioning normally on the surface, but internally something has shifted. The old explanations no longer satisfy. The old motivations no longer pull. The future you once assumed feels distant or strangely irrelevant. And in this space, where identity loosens but has not yet been replaced, synchronicity begins to multiply. This multiplication is not a reward, it is a symptom. When identity is stable, perception is narrow. You move through life guided by habit, expectation, and memory. But when identity begins to dissolve, perception widens. The mind no longer filters experience through the same rigid framework. Connections that were always present suddenly become visible. Timing feels deliberate, encounters feel weighted, words land differently. It's not that reality has changed, it's that the lens through which you experience it has temporarily cleared. This is why people often describe this phase as overwhelming, not because it is chaotic, but because it is too coherent. Too many things seem to align at once. Too many moments feel meaningful. Too many coincidences arrive back to back. And without understanding what is happening, the mind searches for explanations. It tries to label the experience as spiritual awakening, manifestation, guidance, or destiny. But these labels, while comforting, miss the deeper truth. What is actually happening is that the identity you once relied on to interpret reality is no longer doing its job. You felt this destabilization in your body, even if you never named it. A sense of standing between lives, between roles, between directions. You're not lost exactly, but you're not anchored either. And it's here, in this in-between, that synchronicity becomes unavoidable. Because without a fixed identity to collapse meaning into something ordinary, experience remains raw, untranslated, alive. This is also why synchronicities during this phase don't feel playful. They feel serious, almost sobering. You don't smile at them the way you used to. You pause, you take them in. Something in you understands that these moments are not offering possibility. They are revealing inevitability. They don't ask for interpretation. They ask for acknowledgement. And here's where it becomes uncomfortable. Because if synchronicity intensifies during identity collapse, then its presence is not a promise that everything will work out. It is an indication that the life you are holding together is no longer structurally viable. The old story cannot continue unchanged. Something must reorganize. Something must give way. And reality reflects this truth long before your conscious mind is ready to accept it. This is why many people retreat when synchronicities peak. They numb themselves, they distract, they reassert old routines, they explain away the meaning. Not because they don't feel it, but because feeling it requires letting go of the certainty they still cling to. Synchronicity exposes the fragility of identity. An identity, when threatened, will do almost anything to survive. But if you are still here, still listening, it's because you are no longer trying to preserve what is already dissolving. You're not chasing meaning, you're noticing it. And that distinction matters because chasing keeps identity intact. Noticing allows it to loosen further. And the loosening is the point. You may have wondered why synchronicities seem to arrive all at once, only to fade later. This is why. They are not meant to be permanent companions. They are transitional markers. They appear most vividly when identity is in flux, when the old structure has weakened, but the new one has not yet solidified. Once a new orientation stabilizes, perception narrows again, not into blindness, but into coherence. The flood recedes. The markers have done their job. This understanding reframes the fear many people feel when synchronicities slow down or stop. It isn't abandonment, it isn't disconnection, it is consolidation. The identity that was forming has now taken shape, and with it, the need for excessive signaling disappears. Meaning no longer needs to announce itself. It has been integrated. But during the collapse phase, when you are between selves, synchronicity serves a very specific function. It keeps you from mistaking disintegration for error. It shows you that even as the old structure falls apart, something deeper remains coordinated. That coherence still exists beneath the surface, not to reassure you, but to prevent you from retreating into the familiar out of fear. This is why these moments feel so intimate, so personal. They arrive without spectacle. A phrase overheard at the right moment, a meeting that rearranges your priorities, a delay that reroutes your entire trajectory. These are not random events imbued with meaning after the fact. They are reflections of a deeper reorganization already underway. You're not imagining this, and you're not projecting meaning onto chaos. What you're sensing is the temporary visibility of structure during transition. The scaffolding of identity has loosened, and the underlying pattern is briefly exposed. And once you've seen this, you cannot return to interpreting synchronicity as something light or optional. Because if synchronicity intensifies when identity dissolves, then it is not asking you to believe, it is asking you to recognize that you are already mid-transition, already between versions, already past the point where the old orientation can fully return. And this is where the stakes quietly rise, because identity collapse does not last forever. It resolves, it reorganizes, and when it does, the question is no longer whether you noticed the signs, but whether you were willing to acknowledge what they were marking, whether you allowed the reorganization to complete or tried to force yourself back into a structure that had already failed. This is the moment most people never name, the moment when synchronicity stops feeling mystical and starts feeling final, when it no longer whispers but simply stands there, undeniable, not guiding you forward but showing you that something irreversible has already begun. And once that realization lands, the nature of synchronicity changes again, because what comes next is not about identity dissolving, but about the threshold that dissolution reveals. A line you may not have known you crossed, but one you can no longer uncross. There comes a moment when synchronicity stops feeling like something that is happening to you and starts feeling like something that has already happened through you. It's subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But once you notice it, the entire tone of your experience changes. You realize that these moments are no longer asking for interpretation. They are simply present, solid, exact, and they carry a quiet implication that is impossible to ignore. This is the point where most people try to reframe what they're experiencing into something safer, something softer. They call it reassurance, they call it guidance, they call it encouragement. But beneath those comforting labels is a deeper recognition that few are willing to sit with. Synchronicity, at its most precise, does not invite you forward. It reveals that you are already standing somewhere new. You can feel this difference immediately. Earlier in life, coincidences felt exciting. They lifted you, they made you feel seen. But now, when they appear, they don't create enthusiasm. They create stillness, a pause, a sense of gravity, almost as if something has quietly locked into place. You don't ask what it means anymore. You know what it means. And that knowing doesn't come with celebration. It comes with responsibility. This is the threshold moment, the point where synchronicity marks not possibility, but permanence, not direction, but position. It doesn't say, you could go this way. It says, you are already here. What makes this moment so unsettling is that it rarely announces itself as important. There is no dramatic event, no obvious crossing. Often it looks ordinary from the outside. A conversation ends. A decision is made without ceremony. A realization lands without fireworks, and yet something irreversible has occurred. The internal landscape has shifted in a way that cannot be undone, even if you tried. You may recognize this from your own life. That moment when you realized you could no longer pretend, could no longer unsee something, could no longer want what you once wanted without feeling misaligned. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed outwardly, but inwardly the old configuration dissolved. And it was only after that dissolution that synchronicity began to confirm what you already knew but hadn't fully accepted yet. This is why synchronicity at this stage feels sobering rather than magical. It doesn't uplift you into hope, it grounds you into truth. It removes plausible deniability. It gently but firmly shows you that the story you've been telling yourself about being undecided, unready, or unsure no longer applies. Something in you has already moved on. And this is where the misunderstanding becomes dangerous, because many people interpret this phase as a call to do more, to act faster, to lean in harder, to capitalize on the meaning they're perceiving. But this urge is itself a form of resistance, an attempt to regain control at the very moment control is no longer required. Synchronicity does not accelerate when you chase it. It clarifies when you stop interfering. The threshold marked by synchronicity is not crossed through effort. It is crossed through recognition, through the quiet acceptance that a choice has already been made at a level deeper than conscious will. And once that acceptance occurs, the world no longer needs to persuade you. It simply reflects where you stand. You can sense this in how synchronicities change their character. They become fewer but sharper, less frequent but more exact. They no longer surround you, they punctuate you. Each one lands like a period at the end of a sentence rather than an invitation to continue writing. And this precision is not accidental. It reflects the stabilization of a new internal orientation. This is also why the threshold feels uncrossable, not because you are trapped, but because the previous identity no longer exists in the same way. You could try to return to it, but it would feel hollow, forced, inauthentic. The internal coherence that once supported it has dissolved. And without that coherence, the old life cannot fully resume. Most people experience this as a subtle grief, not dramatic sadness, but a quiet mourning for a version of themselves they didn't realize they were already leaving behind. And synchronicity, rather than comforting that grief, simply acknowledges it. It doesn't soften the transition, it marks it. This is the moment where many people disengage from meaning altogether. They decide it's safer to live without interpretation than to accept the implications of what they've recognized. But disengagement does not undo the threshold, it only delays integration. The crossing has already occurred. The only remaining question is how consciously you inhabit what comes next. And here's the truth that almost no one states plainly. Synchronicity is not benevolent or cruel. It is indifferent to your preferences. It does not care whether you feel ready. It responds to structure, not desire. When an internal structure collapses and a new one stabilizes, synchronicity marks that stabilization. It doesn't ask for your opinion, it doesn't negotiate, it simply appears. If this feels confronting, it's because it strips away the illusion that you are waiting for permission. You are not waiting. You are standing on the other side of something, wondering when it happened. And the appearance of synchronicity is the only reason you begin to suspect the crossing has already taken place. This realization changes how you relate to uncertainty. You stop interpreting confusion as a sign you're lost. You recognize it as a natural residue of transition. The mind lags behind structural change. It needs time to reorganize around a new identity. Synchronicity doesn't rush this process. It simply confirms that the change itself is real. You may notice now that certain questions no longer feel relevant. The old what-if scenarios lose their charge. The urge to seek validation fades. You don't need to be convinced anymore, and that is perhaps the clearest sign that the threshold has been crossed. Not excitement, not clarity, but quiet resolve. And if you're still listening, still allowing this to land, it's because you recognize yourself in this description. You're not at the beginning of a journey. You're at the point where the journey has already altered you, where synchronicity no longer functions as a compass, but as a boundary marker between who you were and who you can no longer pretend to be. But recognition alone is not integration. Seeing the threshold is not the same as embodying it. And this is where the work subtly shifts. Because once you understand that synchronicity marks the crossing, the question becomes how you live on the other side without chasing signs or clinging to the past. Once the threshold has been crossed, something subtle but profound begins to change in how you move through life. Not outwardly at first. There may be no visible shift in circumstance, no immediate transformation others can point to. But internally, the relationship you have with meaning itself starts to reorganize. Synchronicity no longer feels like something you wait for. It feels like something that arrives only when you are no longer asking. This is where many people become confused. They assume that because synchronicity marked the crossing, it must now be followed, amplified, or maintained. They try to stay in the heightened state. They begin watching more closely, interpreting more aggressively, searching for confirmation that the transition was real. But this impulse, though understandable, quietly pulls them back toward the very identity that has already dissolved. the one that needed reassurance, the one that required permission. True integration begins when the need to decode fades. You may notice this happening already. The urge to scan for signs softens. The compulsion to explain coincidences loosens. Not because synchronicity disappears, but because it no longer needs to be monitored. It becomes background coherence rather than foreground spectacle. And this shift can feel unsettling at first, because it removes a familiar source of orientation. You are no longer being nudged, you are simply moving. This is the point where synchronicity reveals its final function, not as guidance and not as confirmation, but as a mirror that has already done its work. Once the reflection is internalized, the mirror no longer needs to be held up continuously. You don't keep checking to see if you've crossed the threshold once you're already standing on the other side. You begin learning how to inhabit the new ground beneath your feet. Integration is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as a different posture toward uncertainty, a different tolerance for not knowing. Decisions begin to feel less dramatic. You no longer frame them as forks in the road that could define your entire future. They feel more like natural extensions of a direction that is already set. Not because you're certain of outcomes, but because you're no longer split internally. This is where synchronicity becomes almost invisible again, not because it's gone, but because it has been absorbed into how you perceive reality. You stop labeling moments as signs, you simply recognize coherence when it appears, and because you are no longer grasping for it, it tends to arrive with greater precision. Fewer events carry weight, but the ones that do land cleanly, without drama, without excess meaning, without the need to convince. You may notice that life begins to feel strangely simpler during this phase. Not easier, necessarily, but less cluttered. Fewer internal arguments, fewer imagined alternatives. The energy that once went into monitoring meaning now flows into presence, and presence itself becomes the orienting principle. You don't need to know where things are going to know how to move. This is also the stage where many people misinterpret what is happening and assume they've lost their connection. They compare this quieter coherence to the earlier flood of signs and conclude that something has diminished. But what has actually happened is consolidation. The nervous system has stabilized around a new identity. The perceptual aperture has narrowed again, not into blindness, but into functionality. You are no longer between worlds, you are inhabiting one. And this is where synchronicity reveals something essential about responsibility. When you stop chasing signs, you stop outsourcing agency. You no longer attribute your choices to external confirmation. You recognize that the movement is coming from you, from a place that no longer requires permission. And this recognition doesn't inflate the ego, it humbles it, because you see how much of your life was previously spent waiting to feel ready, waiting to feel certain, waiting for alignment to appear as proof. Integration ends that waiting. You begin to understand that synchronicity never existed to relieve you of choice. It existed to show you when choice had already been exercised at a deeper level. And once you accept that, the quality of your action changes. You don't act impulsively. You act quietly, without announcement, without justification, without the need to explain your reasoning to yourself or others. Relationships shift here as well. You may notice that certain connections naturally fall away, not through conflict, but through irrelevance. Others deepen without effort. Conversations feel more precise. You say less, but what you say lands more clearly, and when endings occur, they don't feel like failures, they feel like completions, like something finishing its role in your life without needing to be forced. And this is embodiment, not as a technique, but as a state. The body begins to trust the direction before the mind catches up. You feel yourself moving in ways that would have previously required explanation. And because you are no longer narrating every step, life begins to meet you with a matching simplicity, less noise, fewer obstacles, more exact timing. Synchronicity, in this phase, doesn't try to get your attention. It doesn't need to. It appears only when it serves integration, when it helps stabilize the new orientation rather than destabilize it. And because of this, it may feel less frequent but more consequential. A single encounter may replace a dozen signs. A single sentence may carry more weight than a cascade of coincidences once did. You may also notice a growing intolerance for forcing, for strategies that rely on manipulation, urgency, or pressure. These approaches feel out of sync with the internal coherence you're inhabiting. You don't judge them. They simply no longer fit. And this quiet refusal to force becomes one of the clearest indicators that integration is underway. What emerges in place of sign chasing is trust. Not blind trust, but embodied trust. Trust that movement will continue without constant feedback. Trust that you don't need to be reminded at every step. Trust that the threshold you crossed was real, even if no one else can see it yet. And this trust doesn't make you passive, it makes you steady. And this steadiness is often misread by others as detachment. But internally, it feels like alignment without tension. Like walking without looking at your feet. Like breathing without counting. You're no longer monitoring reality for reassurance. You're participating in it. And perhaps the most important integration of all is this. You stop asking what synchronicity means, because you realize it was never meant to be understood in isolation. It was meant to be lived through. It marked a crossing. It intensified during dissolution. And now it recedes as you inhabit the life that crossing made possible. You are no longer trying to prove that something has changed. You are simply living from the place where it already has. And when that happens, the final layer reveals itself. Not as another sign, not as another pattern, but as a quiet recognition that the way you move through reality has fundamentally shifted, that you are no longer oriented toward confirmation, but toward coherence itself. If you pause for a moment now, you may notice something subtle but undeniable. The way this topic feels in your body has changed. At the beginning, synchronicity may have felt like a mystery to be solved, or a phenomenon to be understood. But now it feels quieter, heavier, more settled, as if something has shifted from curiosity into recognition. That shift is not intellectual, it's structural, and it's happening in real time. You can sense that the question is no longer, what is synchronicity? The question has quietly become, what has already changed in me? Because the truth you've been circling is not about signs or meanings at all. It's about orientation, about the moment you stopped waiting for confirmation and started noticing coherence instead. About the recognition that the most important shifts in your life did not announce themselves. They revealed themselves afterward. This is the return to the opening paradox, now seen clearly. You didn't come here to learn something new. You came here because something in you had already crossed a line, and this reflection arrived to help you name it. Synchronicity was never asking for your belief. It was marking the moment belief became irrelevant, when something in you settled deeply enough that reality no longer needed to persuade you. Take a breath here, let that land. There is a version of you who began this video still subtly waiting for the next sign, waiting for the next confirmation, waiting for permission to trust what you already sensed. And there is a version of you listening now who no longer feels that same tension. Because everything is clear, but because something has resolved. You're not reaching anymore, you're standing. This is the activation threshold. Not a dramatic crossing, not an awakening, but a quiet internal acknowledgement that you are no longer oriented towards signs. You are oriented toward coherence. And once that orientation shifts, the way you move through reality changes without effort. You stop scanning, you stop chasing, you stop asking reality to reassure you at every step. You simply participate. The version of you who reached this point is not the same as the one who arrived. Something has integrated, something has stabilized, and even if you can't yet articulate what that is, your body knows. Your nervous system knows. The way this feels is the evidence. This is why marking moments like this matters. Not because anything needs to be proven, but because recognition anchors experience. When you name a threshold, you allow it to complete. When you witness a shift consciously, it stabilizes. And this stabilization is not just personal, it contributes to coherence beyond you, in the way you speak, the way you decide, the way you relate. So before we close, there is a small ritual I want to offer. Not as a request and not as an instruction, but as an opportunity to anchor what has already occurred. If something in this transmission resonated, and if you felt that quiet internal click, that sense of recognition rather than learning, then writing a short declaration can help seal that shift, not for me, not for visibility, but as a way of acknowledging, in language, what your system has already integrated. Write this in the comments to anchor this shift. I no longer wait for signs. I move from coherence. Only write it if it feels true. Only write it if it resonates in your body as something already happening. There is no obligation here. The declaration doesn't create the shift, it simply reflects it. And whether you write it or not, know this: the way you see synchronicity has already changed. You may notice it less, not more. You may feel it differently, more grounded, less dramatic, more exact. And that is how you know the integration is real, because synchronicity was never meant to be a spectacle. It was meant to guide you to the point where guidance was no longer required, to the place where your internal alignment became the signal, where movement no longer needed explanation. As you return to your life after this moment, you don't need to look for anything. Simply notice how differently you respond, how decisions feel quieter, how timing feels less urgent, how meaning no longer demands your attention but meets you when necessary. This is the after, the place where synchronicity no longer tries to get your attention, because it no longer needs to. And if you ever find yourself wondering whether something truly changed, remember this: the most significant thresholds are not crossed with certainty, they are crossed with recognition. And once crossed, they are not undone. You didn't come here to be shown something. You came here because you were ready to see it differently, and now you do.